The Nexus chamber fell silent as Judge Corvin Thriss entered, his black robes trailing behind him like shadows of judgment itself. The assembled delegates from 47 species shifted uncomfortably in their bioadapted seating, their various forms of breathing creating a discordant symphony of unease. They had expected another placid Etherean judge, or perhaps a methodical crystalline arbiter. They had not expected this, a human. Ambassador Vextai of the hegemony clicked his mandibles nervously. Esteemed colleagues, his translator rendered, his chittering into universal standard, surely there has been some administrative error. The Judicial Council has never appointed a member of such a volatile species. The ancient arbiter Nimros, whose species had overseen galactic law for 3 millennia, extended one of her gossamer tendrils toward a holographic display. The appointment stands. Ambassador, the human colonies have achieved the required technological and societal benchmarks. Their jurisprudence examination scores were unprecedented. Unprecedented how? Demanded General Quotek of the militant Razorclaw Federation, his scaled hide rippling with aggressive patterns. Perfect scores across all scenarios, Nimros replied, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic inevitability, including the theoretical frameworks we believed impossible to solve. Judge Thriss stepped to the elevated platform, his pale blue eyes scanning the assembly with unsettling intensity. Unlike the ornate ceremonial garments of other species representatives, his simple black robe seemed to absorb light itself. He carried no ceremonial implements, no status symbols, only a small data pad and what appeared to be an ancient leather-bound book. Honored delegates, Thriss began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. I understand your concerns. My species has a reputation for unpredictability, but I assure you, I am here to serve justice according to the Galactic Legal Codex, nothing more. High Counselor Zinthara of the Seraphim Collective, whose species prided themselves on emotional transcendence, leaned forward with uncharacteristic urgency. Judge Thriss, while we acknowledge humanity's intellectual achievements, we must address the elephant in the room. Your species' documented capacity for violence exceeds that of any other sentient race by several orders of magnitude. A bitter smile crossed Thriss's weathered features. Violence, counselor, or justice? Your files on humanity are remarkably incomplete for beings who claim intellectual superiority. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. Ambassador Krilmer of the Merchant Guild nervously adjusted his breathing apparatus. What do you mean, incomplete? You know about our wars, our conflicts, our capacity for destruction, Thriss said, opening his leather book, a genuine Earth-manufactured artifact that several delegates recognized as a symbol of human legal tradition. But do you know why we fight? Do you understand the philosophical framework that drives our concept of justice? The question hung in the air like a challenge. The assembled delegates had reviewed humanity's military history with growing alarm over the past century. The siege of Kepler for Fortubie, where humans had fought for 6 months with no resupply. The defense of the Titan colonies, where outnumbered human forces had held off the Void Swarm until civilian evacuation was complete. The brutal efficiency with which human privateers had dismantled the Crimson Reach piracy network, leaving no survivors, but also no innocent casualties. Your reputation precedes you. General Quotek growled, his species equivalent of nervous laughter. Every conflict you've entered has ended in total victory or total destruction. There is no middle ground with humans. Because, Thriss said, closing the book with a soft thud that echoed through the chamber, we understand that justice delayed is justice denied. We understand that mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent, and we understand that sometimes the only way to preserve civilization is to be willing to do what others will not. Arbiter Nimros S. tendrils writhed with what those familiar with her species recognized as deep concern. Judge Thriss, your first case docket contains 847 pending prosecutions, some dating back to centuries. The previous judge's approach was to seek rehabilitation and reintegration. The previous judge, Thriss interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that made several delegates' defensive systems trigger involuntarily, allowed the flesh merchants of Tau Ceti to operate for 37 years. While seeking diplomatic solutions, he permitted the corporate syndicate to maintain slave labor camps across 8 systems while negotiating compliance frameworks. He watched as the Red Banner pirates sold captured children to the highest bidders. While exploring restorative justice options, the silence that followed was deafening. Every delegate in the chamber was suddenly aware that their previous assumptions about humanity That they were merely violent, but ultimately controllable had been catastrophically wrong. The executions, Judge Thriss continued, opening his datapad, begin tomorrow at 08:00 Universal Standard Time. I suggest you all review your own legal standings very carefully. As he spoke, the chamber's security systems registered something that had never occurred in 3,000 years of galactic jurisprudence. Every single delegate's biosigns indicated genuine, primal fear. The age of consequences had begun. The holding cells beneath the Nexus judicial complex had not been designed for executions. For 3 millennia, they had served as comfortable rehabilitation centers, complete with species-appropriate accommodations, recreational facilities, and therapeutic programs. The morning after Judge Thriss's appointment, construction drones swarmed the lower levels, their plasma cutters carving new chambers with mechanical precision. Admiral Gorvik of the Crimson Reapers pressed his scarred face against the energy barrier of his cell, watching the modifications with growing unease. In his 70-year career as a slave trader, he had never encountered a judge who actually intended to carry out a death sentence. The previous judiciary had been content with stern warnings, mandatory education programs, and supervised probation. This is highly irregular, protested defense advocate Pelsin, his crystalline form refracting the harsh construction lights into rainbow patterns. My client has been sentenced to rehabilitation, not execution. The Galactic Legal Codex clearly states, Article 847, Section 12. Judge Thriss interrupted without looking up from his case files. Capital crimes against sentient beings, including but not limited to mass murder, genocide, and systematic enslavement, are punishable by death when rehabilitation is deemed impossible. He finally raised his eyes to meet the advocate's multifaceted gaze. Tell me, advocate, how do you rehabilitate someone who has personally overseen the torture and murder of 47,000 sentient beings? Pelsim's form flickered a sign of extreme distress in his species. The defendant has agreed to community service, financial restitution to victims' families, and mandatory psychological counseling. With what money? Thriss asked, his voice cutting through the advocate's prepared arguments like a plasma blade through tissue. Paper, the same blood money he earned selling children into sexual slavery, and psychological counseling. He's a sociopath who enjoys inflicting pain. Your own psychiatric evaluation confirms he shows no remorse and considers his victim subhuman. The construction noise suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous humming that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Through the transparent aluminum walls, the assembled legal teams could see the new execution chamber taking shape. A stark, sterile room dominated by what appeared to be a modified plasma dissolution unit. High Prosecutor Willinara of the Galactic Justice Department materialized in the corridor, her energy-based form crackling with agitation. Judge Thriss, we need to discuss the procedural irregularities in your planned executions. The Galactic Council is in emergency session. Let them talk. Thriss replied, sealing the first case file with a blood-red authentication mark. Admiral Gorvik's execution is scheduled for 0800. The next 7 will follow at 30-minute intervals. I've reviewed all appeals and found them without merit. But the precedent, Thriss said, standing to his full height. Is that justice delayed? Is justice denied? Admiral Gorvik has been appealing his sentence for 12 years, while continuing to operate his slave networks through proxy agents. CEO Morthic has been under review for 2 decades, while his corporate death camps processed another 200,000 workers. Judge Vex High has been in judicial consideration for 15 years, while his victims' families died waiting for closure. The prosecutor's energy form dimmed noticeably. Judge Thriss, please understand, we have maintained galactic stability for 3 millennia. Through careful deliberation and measured responses, your approach threatens to destabilize. My approach threatens to restore actual justice. Thriss cut her off. Tell me, prosecutor, what happened to the Verdant colonies? A collective intake of breath echoed through the corridor. The Verdant colonies had been a peaceful agricultural system, wiped out by the Crimson Reapers 8 years ago. The 4.2 million inhabitants had been systematically murdered or enslaved, their children sold to the highest bidders across the galaxy. That was a tragedy. Willinara managed. That was preventable. Thriss corrected. Admiral Gorvik had been on trial for identical crimes for 4 years when he attacked Verdant. Your careful deliberation allowed him to murder 4.2 million people while you debated the finer points of rehabilitation theory. The first execution chamber finished its final systems check with a soft chime. Through the observation window, the dissolution unit powered up, its containment field glowing with lethal energy. "This is madness," whispered defense advocate Pelseem. "The galactic community will never accept this precedent." Jetstress looked at the assembled legal professionals with something that might have been pity. The galactic community created this precedent when they chose to value the comfort of criminals over the lives of their victims. I'm simply correcting a systemic failure. The chronometer above the main corridor displayed 7:55 Universal Standard Time. In the holding cells, Admiral Gorvik had stopped pacing and was now standing perfectly still, his predatory instincts finally recognizing that he was no longer the hunter. "Bring him up," Jetstress ordered, as the security drones activated and began their inexorable march toward the cells. Every being in the facility understood that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The age of endless appeals and comfortable imprisonments was over. The age of consequences had begun in earnest. The first execution lasted exactly 3.7 seconds. Admiral Gorvik's final words, a stream of curses and threats directed at Jetstress, were cut short as the plasma dissolution field reduced him to component atoms. The observation gallery, packed with delegates, prosecutors, and journalists from across the galaxy, fell into absolute silence. The chronometer displayed 8 hours 0 minutes and 4 seconds Universal Standard Time. "Next," Jetstress announced, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. By 10:30, 5 more executions had been carried out with mechanical precision. The galactic news networks had shifted from their regular programming to emergency coverage, their feeds showing crowds gathering on dozens of worlds as the implications of the day's events began to sink in. High Chancellor Murden of the Galactic Council materialized in the judicial complex's main hall, his emergency transport pods still smoking from atmospheric entry. Behind him came a full contingent of council guards, an unprecedented show of force. "At a judicial facility," Jetstress, Murden declared, his voice amplified by the complex's emergency broadcast system, "by order of the Galactic Council, you are hereby commanded to cease all executions pending a full review of judicial procedures." Thriss looked up from his case files, his pale blue eyes reflecting the harsh institutional lighting. "Chancellor, with respect, the Galactic Council has no authority over judicial proceedings. The Nexus judicial system was established as an independent body specifically to prevent political interference in the administration of justice." "This isn't justice," Murden replied, his biomechanical form practically vibrating with rage. "This is a massacre. You've executed 6 beings in 2.5 hours. The standard appeal process, Thriss interrupted, has been exhausted. Every one of these defendants has had their cases reviewed multiple times over periods ranging from 8 to 37 years. They've had legal representation, medical evaluation, psychological assessment, and more due process than they ever gave their victims." The Chancellor's optical sensors flared. "But the cultural implications, many of these defendants come from species where their actions are considered acceptable. Are you seriously arguing," Thriss said, rising from his bench, "that genocide is acceptable because it's culturally relative?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Around the complex, security feeds showed crowds of various species gathering, their reactions ranging from celebration to outrage. On former slave worlds, beings danced in the streets. On the corporate homeworlds, emergency sessions were being called as executives suddenly realized their own liability. Defense advocate Krimdl, representing the remaining defendants, stepped forward with visible desperation. "Your Honor, we've prepared new evidence suggesting that my client's actions were the result of mental illness, cultural conditioning, and systematic societal pressures," Advocate Thriss said, pulling up a holographic display that showed footage from the flesh markets of Tau Ceti. "Your client, Baron Vexmer, personally designed torture devices specifically to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive. For extended periods, he recorded their screams and sold the recordings as entertainment. His own psychiatric evaluation describes him as fully rational, but completely without empathy." The display shifted to show autopsy reports from a slave labor camp. CEO Thrynar modified atmospheric processors on mining worlds to slowly poison workers, maximizing labor extraction before death. The process took exactly 847 days and generated 34% more profit than standard operations. "But the precedent," Krimdl began. "The precedent," Thriss said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. Is that there are consequences for evil, that someone, somewhere, will hold you accountable for the suffering you cause, that the universe is not indifferent to. Injustice. Chancellor Murden stepped closer to the bench, his council guards flanking him. Judge Thriss, you're destroying 3 millennia of legal tradition. The galactic community operates on principles of rehabilitation, understanding, and gradual social evolution. The galactic community, Thriss replied, has presided over the systematic murder of 127 million sentient beings in the last century alone. Your rehabilitation programs have a 94% recidivism rate for violent crimes and a 100% rate for capital offenses. Your understanding has created a system where predators face no meaningful consequences and victims receive no justice. The chronometer showed 10:45. The 7th execution was scheduled for 11 o'clock. Emergency broadcasts from across the galaxy flooded the complex's communication systems. The Merchant Guild was threatening economic sanctions. The military coalition was mobilizing peacekeeping forces. 3 separate species had declared Judge Thriss a threat to galactic stability. But other messages were coming in as well. The survivors of the Verdant colonies had sent a simple transmission. Thank you. The families of victims from a dozen worlds were traveling to the Nexus complex, carrying flowers and photographs of their dead. Former slaves were holding vigils, their faces showing something that had been absent from the galaxy for generations. Hope. Judge Thriss stood as the security drones brought in the 7th defending a creature whose species had no name for itself, only for the pain it inflicted on others. The being had operated a child trafficking network spanning 17 systems, with a customer base that included some of the most powerful figures in galactic society. Your Honor, Defense Advocate Pelseem tried one last time. Surely there must be some alternative. There is, Thriss said quietly. It's called justice. The dissolution chamber hummed a life for the 7th time that day. Across the galaxy, the powerful and corrupt watched their screens with growing terror. Finally, understanding that their long immunity from consequences had come to an end, the executions would continue. The first assassination attempt came at 14:30, just as Judge Thriss was reviewing the file for execution number 12. The snipers positioned a kilometer away on the observation deck of the Nexus Commerce Tower should have been perfect. The hypersonic projectile should have penetrated the judicial complex's defenses without triggering any alarms. It vaporized 3 centimeters from Thriss's head, intercepted by a personal shield system that hadn't been there moments before. Interesting, Thriss murmured, not even looking up from his case files. Someone's getting desperate. The complex's emergency lights bathed everything in red as defensive systems engaged. Through the transparent aluminum walls, security forces could be seen repelling from gunships, their weapons trained on the surrounding buildings. The assassination attempt had been expected. What surprised everyone was how prepared the humans had been. Chancellor Murden burst into the judicial chamber, his biomechanical form crackling with emergency power systems. Judge Thriss, this has gone too far. The Galactic Council is implementing emergency protocols. No, Thriss said simply, continuing to read. I beg your pardon. No. Thriss finally looked up, and for the first time, his pale blue eyes held something other than judicial detachment. They held the cold fury of a species that had crawled out of the primordial mud by being more vicious than anything that tried to eat them. You've had 3,000 years to implement justice, Chancellor. You chose comfort over consequences, political expedience over moral necessity. Now you're going to live with the results. The security feeds showed movement in the corridors, not the chaotic scramble of an assassination response, but the coordinated advance of professional soldiers. The Chancellor's optical sensors focused on the newcomers with growing alarm. Those are human military units, he said, his voice distorting. With electronic interference, you can't bring armed forces into the Nexus Complex. Article 1, 247 of the Judicial Independence Act, Thriss recited without referring to any documents. Judges are authorized to requisition necessary security measures to ensure the continuation of legal proceedings. My security assessment indicated that local forces were insufficient. The human soldiers were unlike anything the galaxy had seen in a judicial context. They moved with the fluid precision of apex predators, their matte black armor absorbing light like Judge Thriss's robes. Most disturbing of all, they showed no deference to the assembled galactic dignitaries in their eyes. Everyone except the judge was a potential threat. High Prosecutor Will Inara materialized in the chamber, her energy form flickering with panic. Judge Thriss were receiving reports of human naval forces moving toward the Nexus system. This is beginning to look like an invasion. It's beginning to look like law enforcement. Thriss corrected. Tell me, Prosecutor, how many of the defendants scheduled for execution today have Confederates still at large? How many have off-world assets that could be used to fund rescue attempts or revenge operations? The question hit like a physical blow in their rush to condemn Thriss's methods. The galactic authorities had ignored the obvious tactical reality. Every criminal they failed to prosecute had networks, resources, and desperate motives to prevent the collapse of the old system. An explosion rocked the complex as the second assassination attempt began. This time, it wasn't a lone sniper, it was a full assault by what appeared to be a private military company. The attackers had corporate-grade weapons, military spec armor, and enough firepower to level a city block. They lasted 7 minutes. The human soldiers moved through the complex like a force of nature, their tactics incorporating lessons learned from centuries of warfare across dozens of worlds. They used no energy weapons that could be detected or jammed, relying instead on kinetic projectiles and precision explosives. That turned the corporate mercenaries into abstract art on the corridor walls. When the smoke cleared, the casualty count was stark. 37 attackers dead, 0 human casualties. This is what you've created, Judge Thriss said to the stunned galactic officials. A system so corrupt, so invested in protecting criminals, that executing mass murderers requires military intervention. The 12th execution proceeded on schedule at 15 o'clock. The defendant, a being who had operated organ harvesting facilities targeting refugee children, died without offering any final words. As the dissolution field powered down, new intelligence reports flooded into the complex. The corporate worlds were mobilizing private fleets. The Merchant Guild was threatening to cut off trade to any system that supported the executions. 3 different species had declared Judge Thriss an enemy of galactic civilization, but other reports told a different story. Slave revolts were breaking out across the Rim territories. Corrupt officials were fleeing their posts as local populations demanded human justice. For the first time in centuries, the victims of the galaxy's broken legal system were standing up to their oppressors. You're tearing the galaxy apart, Chancellor Murden accused. No, Thriss replied, sealing another case file with red ink. I'm revealing that it was already broken. The difference is that now the cracks are visible. The chronometer showed 15:30. 8 more executions were scheduled before the day's end, and intelligence reports suggested that the largest private military force in galactic history was converging on the Nexus system. The human judge looked at the gathering storm with something that might have been satisfaction. For too long, evil had hidden behind bureaucracy and legal technicalities. Now it was forced to show its true face, and humanity had always excelled at killing monsters. The real battle was about to begin. The assault began at 1745 with a coordinated strike by 7 different private military companies, their fleets dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation around the Nexus system. The corporate syndicate had spared no expense. Over 300 ships carrying 50,000 mercenaries, all focused on a single objective: stop the executions by any means necessary. Admiral Kexvorthic commanded the assault from the dreadnought Profitable Venture, his scarred face twisted in grim satisfaction as the first wave of assault shuttles launched toward the judicial complex. All units, remember, we're not here to destroy the facility. We need Judge Thriss alive to reverse the sentences. Minimal collateral damage to the complex itself. He could not have been more wrong about human defensive strategy. The first indication that the mercenaries had underestimated their opposition came when their lead shuttles crossed the outer perimeter of the Nexus system. What they had assumed were navigation buoys revealed themselves as autonomous weapons platforms, their hulls unfolding to reveal particle beam arrays that could core a battleship. Defensive grid is active, reported the tactical officer aboard the Profitable Venture. Sir, those aren't standard Nexus defense systems. The first wave of shuttles simply vanished, erased by intersecting particle beams with surgical precision. But the mercenaries were professionals, and they adapted quickly. The second wave came in under heavy electronic warfare cover, their hulls masked by adaptive camouflage and sensor scramblers. The humans were ready for that too. Commander Desta Okafor watched the tactical display from her position aboard the destroyer Inexorable Justice, one of 12 human naval vessels that had taken position around the complex. Unlike the mercenaries' flashy corporate ships, the human vessels were built for function over formed dark holes that seemed to absorb sensor energy, weapons systems that fired projectiles too fast for point defense, and armor that had been tested. In the furnaces of humanity's most vicious conflicts, ma'am, reported her tactical officer, enemy force is adapting to our outer defenses. They're using the asteroid field for cover and microjumping to avoid our particle platforms. Good, HFY replied, her voice carrying the calm satisfaction of a predator watching prey walk into a trap. Let them think they're winning. The mercenaries' third wave successfully penetrated the outer defenses, their assault shuttles weaving between the weapons platforms like insects through a web. Admiral Vorthik allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as his forces reached the inner system, approaching the complex from multiple vectors. Then the asteroids started shooting back. What the mercenaries had assumed were natural debris fields revealed themselves as perfectly positioned weapons platforms, their rocky surfaces concealing massive railgun installations. The crossfire was devastating kinetic slugs traveling at significant fractions of light speed, guided by targeting systems that could track a single atom across a solar system. This is impossible, Admiral Vorthik snarled as his tactical display showed 17 shuttles destroyed in the first salvo. Intelligence said the humans had minimal defensive capabilities, sir. His communications officer interrupted. We're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. Commander HFY's face appeared on the main screen, her expression carrying the cold professionalism of someone who killed for a living and was very good at it. Admiral Vorthik, this is your only warning. Withdraw your forces immediately, or we will consider you a direct threat to galactic justice and respond accordingly. You're outnumbered 4-1, Vorthik replied, his mandibles clicking with aggression. Surrender now, and we'll ensure your deaths are quick. HFY's smile was the expression of a shark that had just smelled blood. Admiral, you're not outnumbered 4-1. You're surrounded by superior firepower with no escape route. The difference is significant. The human destroyer's main gun spoke once a single railgun round that crossed the distance between fleets in 0.3 seconds and struck the mercenary flagship's primary weapons array. The explosion was visible across the system, a brief star that illuminated the true scope of the human defensive preparations. The battle that followed was less a conflict than a demonstration of the tactical principles that had made humanity the most feared military force in the galaxy. The mercenaries had numbers, but the humans had position, preparation, and 3 centuries of experience in fighting impossible odds. Wave after wave of assault shuttles died in the crossfire. Between hidden weapons platforms, corporate dreadnoughts found themselves targeted by coordinated strikes from multiple angles, their shields collapsing under the focused fire of weapons systems designed to crack planets. The humans fought with mathematical precision, each shot calculated to maximize damage while conserving ammunition. But the mercenaries were not defenseless. Admiral Vorthik's forces included veterans of the Rim Wars, soldiers who had carved out corporate empires with nothing but superior firepower and absolute ruthlessness. When direct assault failed, they adapted to siege tactics, using their superior numbers to establish firing positions throughout the system. The casualties mounted on both sides. The human destroyer Retribution died with all hands when a coordinated missile strike overwhelmed its point defenses. The human positions on the complex's surface took steady losses as mercenary snipers found their ranges. But for every human casualty, the corporate forces lost dozens of their expensive equipment and professional training no match for humanity's fundamental understanding of warfare as applied physics. The turning point came when Admiral Vorthik committed his reserves, sending his personal guard to assault the complex directly. These were not mere mercenaries, but corporate executives, private army soldiers equipped with the best weapons money could buy and trained in the most advanced combat techniques available. They found themselves facing humanity's most terrifying military unit, judges, bailiffs. These were not ordinary soldiers, but humans who had volunteered to serve justice directly, individuals who had looked into the abyss of galactic corruption and chosen to become the mechanism of consequence. They fought not for money or territory, but for the principle that evil should face retribution. The battle for the complex's main hull lasted 4 hours and left the corridors painted with the blood of beings from 17 different species. When it ended, 847 corporate soldiers lay dead, while the executions continued on schedule in the chamber below. At 21:30 Universal Standard Time, the 16th execution of the day was carried out. The defendant, a being who had operated a network of child trafficking rings, died. While the sound of gunfire echoed through the complex above, Admiral Vorthic's fleet began its withdrawal at 22 o'clock. Their losses too heavy to continue the assault. As the surviving corporate ships limped away from the Nexus system, emergency broadcasts flooded the galactic communication networks. The message was simple: justice would not be stopped. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened at 2 o'clock Universal Standard Time, 36 hours after the first execution. The Great Chamber on Centrax Prime, which had hosted diplomatic negotiations for 3 millennia, now resembled a war room. Holographic displays showed fleet movements across the galaxy, casualty reports from the Nexus system, and real-time feeds of uprisings on 17 different worlds. Chancellor Merton's biomechanical form flickered with stress-induced power fluctuations as he addressed the assembled delegates. Honored members, we face an unprecedented crisis. The human judge's actions have destabilized our entire legal framework. Worse, they've inspired copycat movements across the galaxy. We're receiving reports of summary executions, vigilante justice, and complete breakdowns of legal order. High Admiral Zekather of the Combined Fleet stood from his delegation section, his species' natural armor plating gleaming under the chamber's lights. The military situation is untenable. Our assault on the Nexus system failed with catastrophic losses. The humans have revealed defensive capabilities that suggest they've been preparing for this scenario for decades or centuries, added Intelligence Director Villanov, her insectoid form clicking with agitation. Our analysis of the battle data indicates that the human defensive systems were integrated into the Nexus Complex's infrastructure during its original construction. They've been planning this from the moment they joined the galactic community. The implications hung in the air like a physical presence. Every delegate in the chamber was beginning to understand that humanity's appointment to the Judicial Council had not been an opportunistic grab for power. It had been the culmination of a long-term strategy to reform galactic justice. Then we removed them by force, declared General Quotek, his scaled hide rippling with aggressive patterns. The Razorclaw Federation offers 500,000 troops for immediate deployment. With what justification? Interrupted Ambassador Krilmer. Of the Merchant Guild. Legally, Judge Thriss is operating within established judicial authority. Every execution has been carried out according to existing statutes. We can't simply declare war on the judicial system because we don't like its effectiveness. Effectiveness? Chancellor Merton's voice distorted with electronic feedback. He's executed 18 beings in 2 days. Our entire legal philosophy is based on rehabilitation and gradual social improvement. Your legal philosophy, came a new voice, has resulted in 127 million murders in the last century alone. Every head in the chamber turned toward the main entrance, where Judge Corvin Thriss stood flanked by the human bailiffs. His black robe seemed to absorb the chamber's carefully calibrated lighting, creating a zone of darkness that made the surrounding delegates instinctively step back. You have no authority here, Chancellor Merton declared, his mechanical components warring with emergency power systems. This is a closed session of the Galactic Council. Article 2, 847 of the Judicial Independence Act, Thriss replied, walking down the center aisle toward the speaker's podium. Judges are authorized to address the council when legal precedents affecting galactic stability are under discussion. He paused, his pale blue eyes scanning the assembled delegates. And my understanding is that you're discussing whether to declare war on the judicial system. The silence that followed was deafening. Several delegates' biological systems triggered involuntary stress responses, filling the chamber with the scents and sounds of various species' fear reactions. Judge Thriss reached the podium and activated the chamber's central holographic display. The image that appeared made every being in the room recoil. A detailed schematic of the galaxy, showing crime statistics, legal processing times, and victim mortality rates. This, Thriss said, his voice carrying clearly through the chambers. Acoustics is what your 3,000 years of enlightened justice has accomplished. Look at the numbers. 94% recidivism rate for violent crimes, 100% for capital offenses. The average time between conviction and sentence implementation, 847 days for theft, 2,643 days for assault, 7,854 days for murder, and 12,456 days for genocide. The display shifted to show specific cases beings who had committed atrocities. While their appeals were processed, criminals who had used the legal system's delays to expand their operations, victims who had died waiting for justice. The flesh markets of Tau Ceti operated for 37 years while their case was under review. Thrift continued. In that time, they processed 2.3 million sentient beings. The corporate syndicate's slave labor camps expanded to 8 systems. During their appeals process, killing 847,000 workers. The Red Banner pirates sold 94,000 children to the highest bidders. While you debated the philosophical implications of punishment, High Admiral Zekather stood, his species equivalent of challenging behavior. Judge Thriss, your methods are creating chaos across the galaxy. We've had to deploy peacekeeping forces to 17 systems to suppress revolts by beings who finally believe justice is possible. Thriss interrupted. Tell me, Admiral, how many of those peacekeeping deployments are protecting corrupt officials from their victims? The question hit like a plasma blast. Every delegate in the chamber was suddenly aware that the instability they were discussing was actually the collapse of systems that had protected the guilty at the expense of the innocent. Defense advocate Pelseem stepped forward, his crystalline form refracting the chamber's lights into prismatic patterns. Your Honor, surely there must be some middle ground. There is, Thriss said quietly. It's called justice, swift, certain, and proportional to the crime committed. He turned to address the full assembly. You want to know why humans were chosen for the Judicial Council? Because we understand something that you've forgotten in your 3 millennia of comfortable civilization. Evil exists. It cannot be negotiated with, rehabilitated, or wished away. It can only be stopped. Chancellor Murden's optical sensors flared. You're destroying everything we've built. I'm revealing that. What you built was a lie, Thriss replied. A comfortable lie that allowed you to sleep at night while innocents died. But lies have consequences, and those consequences have been building for centuries. The chamber's emergency systems activated as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The corporate syndicate's private fleets were converging on Centrax Prime. The Merchant Guild had issued ultimatums to 17 governments. 3 different species had declared Judge Thriss a threat to galactic civilization and were mobilizing military forces, but other reports painted a different picture. On former slave worlds, newly liberated populations were establishing human-style judicial systems. Corrupt officials were fleeing their posts as local populations demanded immediate trials. For the first time in galactic history, the victims were organizing faster than their oppressors. You have a choice, Judge Thriss said, his voice cutting through the chaos of incoming communications. You can continue protecting criminals and enabling evil, or you can join the side of justice. But understand this, the age of comfortable compromises is over. The executions will continue until the galaxy's debt to its victims is paid. As if to emphasize his point, the chamber's main display showed a live feed from the Nexus complex, where the 19th execution was beginning. The defendant, a being who had operated force breeding programs for exotic species, faced the dissolution chamber with the same mechanical precision that had characterized all the previous deaths. The Galactic Council had reached its moment of decision. They could declare war on justice itself, or they could finally acknowledge that some crimes deserved nothing less than death. The vote would determine the fate of civilizations. 6 months after the first execution, Judge Corvin Thriss stood in his private chambers, reviewing the final case files of what historians would later call the Great Reckoning. The leather-bound book that had accompanied him to his first day on the bench lay open beside him, its pages filled with notations and his careful handwriting a record of justice finally served. The galaxy had changed beyond recognition. The corporate syndicate had collapsed after its leadership faced human-style trials, their assets redistributed to their victims' families. The Merchant Guild had been restructured under new regulations that made exploitation a capital offense. 3 species had attempted to declare war on the judicial system, had surrendered after witnessing orbital bombardments of their military installations, while the 3rd had simply ceased to exist as a political entity. Ambassador Vextai entered the chamber, his mandibles clicking nervously, a habit he developed since the executions began. Judge Thriss, the final statistics are complete. 847 executions carried out across 17 judicial districts, 0 appeals successful, 0 sentences commuted, and the recidivism rate? Thriss asked without looking up from his files. 0%, Your Honor. Complete deterrent effect. Thriss allowed himself a thin smile. It's amazing how effective consequences can be when they're actually implemented. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of Chancellor Murden, his biomechanical form moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to fear the consequences of his actions. The emergency session 6 months ago had ended with the Galactic Council's complete capitulation. Faced with the choice between civil war and reform, they had chosen to survive. Judge Morden said, his voice carefully modulated to show proper respect. The Council has approved your proposal for the Universal Justice Amendment. All member species will implement human-style judicial systems within the standard years, and the resistance movements crushed. The last holdout was the Crimson Reach, but after Admiral Okafor's fleet glassed their command stations, the surviving pirates surrendered unconditionally. Murden paused, his optical sensors dimming. Your Honor, I must ask, was this always the plan? Thriss finally looked up from his files, his pale blue eyes reflecting the chamber's soft lighting. Chancellor, humans have been studying galactic society for over 2 centuries. We watched as your enlightened justice system created the largest criminal enterprise in known history. We saw civilizations destroyed while their killers lived in comfortable detention centers. We documented every failure, every compromise, every time you chose the comfort of criminals over the lives of their victims. He stood and walked to the chamber's main window, which offered a view of the Nexus Complex's Memorial Plaza. Thousands of beings moved through the carefully tended gardens, many carrying photographs of family members who had died waiting for justice. At the plaza center stood a simple monument, a black stone pillar inscribed with the names of every victim whose death had been avenged during the Great Reckoning. The plan, Thriss continued, was always to restore actual justice to the galaxy. Your species created wonderful technologies, explored magnificent philosophies, and built impressive civilizations. But you forgot the most basic requirement of any functional society: consequences for evil actions. Chancellor Murden's mechanical components whirred softly. The casualty reports from the past 6 months: over 3 million beings dead in various conflicts related to the judicial reforms, 3 million criminals, corrupt officials, and those who chose to fight for the right to commit atrocities. Thriss corrected, balanced against 127 million victims they would have claimed under the old system. It represents a 95% reduction in unjust deaths. The mathematics were undeniable, but Murden's programming still struggled with the moral implications. But surely, there must have been another way. There was, Thriss said, turning back to face the Chancellor. You could have implemented justice yourselves at any point during the last 3,000 years. You chose not to. The responsibility for what followed rests entirely with those who created the conditions that made it necessary. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication. The main display activated to show Commander Desta Okafor, now promoted to Admiral of the Galactic Justice Fleet, reporting from the bridge of her flagship Inevitable Consequence. Judge Thriss, she said, her scarred face showing the satisfaction of someone who had spent 6 months hunting the galaxy's worst criminals. The last of the Red Banner pirates has been eliminated. Captain Morgan died fighting rather than face trial, but his entire network has been dismantled. The slave camps in the Outer Rim have been liberated, and the survivors are being relocated to rehabilitation centers. Casualties: light on R. Side 17 killed, 43 wounded. Enemy casualties were total. No prisoners taken. As per standing orders for capital crimes involving children. Thriss nodded approvingly. Excellent work, Admiral. Return to base for refit and reassignment. As the communication ended, Chancellor Murden processed the implications of what he had just witnessed. Judge Thriss, are you saying that humans will continue to enforce galactic justice through military action? We're saying that justice will be enforced, period. The method depends entirely on the level of cooperation we receive. Thriss returned to his desk and opened a new case file. Tell me, Chancellor, are you familiar with the concept of deterrence? The theory that fear of punishment prevents criminal behavior? The reality that certainty of consequences eliminates criminal behavior? Thriss corrected. For the first time in galactic history, beings considering criminal actions know that they will face swift, certain, and proportional punishment. The crime rate has dropped by 97% across all monitored systems. The statistics were undeniable. Piracy had virtually ceased to exist. Corporate exploitation had ended overnight as executives faced the same fate as their historical counterparts. Even minor crimes like theft and fraud had plummeted as beings realized that the old system of endless appeals and comfortable sentences was gone forever. But the cultural impact is that civilized beings can walk safely through their cities. For the first time in centuries, this finished. Children are no longer sold in markets. Workers are paid fair wages. Refugees are not systematically murdered for their organs. The cultural impact is that the galaxy has remembered how to be civilized as the day's final light filtered through the chamber's windows. Justice completed his review of the last case file from the Great Reckoning, 847 executions, each one representing thousands of lives saved from future atrocities. The mathematics were simple, elegant, and irrefutable. The leather-bound book closed with a soft thud that echoed through the chamber. On its cover, embossed in gold letters, were the words that had guided humanity's approach to justice for millennia. Equal justice under law. The galaxy had finally learned what those words meant. Outside the window, the memorial plaza filled with beings of dozens of species, all carrying flowers to honor the victims whose deaths had finally been avenged. For the first time in galactic history, the innocent could sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, human judges stood watch against the night. The age of consequences had become the age of peace. Justice had been served.